Hello you lot, Miller Corner here, welcome back once again, and today we're fixing what might well be the worst bit of my Alfa GTV. The wheels. Yes, they are teledials and that does mean they look awesome, but they also look like that. They're curbed, they're corroded, the paint's flaking off, they are not in a good way. Now you can of course take your wheels to get professionally refurbished, but first of all, that's not really possible in the current climate, and second of all, you'd be talking about 100, 150 quid a wheel to get that done, and frankly, that's not how I roll. So instead, we're going to be doing a DIY wheel refurb at home on the cheap that is going to turn these very pretty, but otherwise knackered teledials back to their former glory. First things first though, I've got to get the wheels off the car. Give me a minute, won't you? Well, that is so much quicker than jacking the car up, taking the wheel off and carrying it through the garage. Anyway, now it is off the car, we can get a look at quite how bad these wheels actually are. Now I've deliberately chosen this one, which was the worst one of the four, to show you just how much better you can get them even doing this DIY and not paying someone else a chunk of money to do it with a machine. Right from the beginning you can see that this wheel is not in a good way. We've got areas like this with fairly light corrosion on them, right the way to areas like this, which are, well, how can I put it, rather more corroded. It's also got a couple of nice chunky curb marks in it and general curb rash all the way around it, which means that this is letting the side down, shall we say. So now we know quite how bad this wheel is, it's time to fix it. Now first things first, we're going to focus on all these corroded bits, and the traditional method for flattening back corroded bits is with a wire brush, but that's a little bit 20th century for my liking, so instead we've got this, a massive power drill with a wire brush attachment on the end, and rather than me spending hours and hours and hours buffing each individual bit smooth with some old wire brush, we've got a really very sharp attachment on this drill that can spin at several hundred RPM. You will of course need safety goggles for this because there's bits of paint and dust and all kinds of stuff flying around. Remember your PPE, people. The last thing we need is to be getting more people in hospital than is strictly necessary, particularly with what's going on at the moment. The wire brush attachment on the drill allows a more aggressive removal of corrosion. What's more, you can still adjust the speed and the pressure depending on how corroded an area actually is. Generally, the more bubbled up the area, the worse it is, and the more will flake off in a powdery mess once it's been wire brushed enough. You need to keep brushing the affected area until you're through to shiny bare metal, and that way you know the corrosion is completely gone. Try to agitate the affected paint at an angle so that if the corrosion is spread beneath the paint, you can flake it off and expose any hidden areas. Keep knocking the corroded paint back until you're left with bare metal and slight bumps in transitions over to paint. Oh, and word to the wise, the faster the drill's spinning, particularly on a really curved wheel like this one, the harder it is to control, so it's far better to back the speed off a bit and do a more progressive, controllable attack on the corrosion. We're just using the wire brush on this bit here, and it's pretty much popped where the brush has gone through the bubbles in the paint, and it's kind of rippled all the way up here, and it's chucked all this dust out, and you can see that underneath it is all white, so indeed it is all corroded in there, and you do realise when you actually skim it back how far it can go in. I mean, look how much further this is than that initial ripple was in the paint. So you need to be really thorough with the brush to make sure you've got the entire corroded bit knocked back and you are back to smooth metal that you can attempt to paint. With that, let's get back to using that not in any way satisfying wire brush. After a couple of hours thoroughly wire brushing all the corrosion out, we're left with this. It is day 2 of the wheel refurb because frankly it was getting very late. Anyway, now that we have wire brushed off all of the corroded bits, the wheel is actually looking ever so slightly worse. But as with so many improvement jobs, it's about getting worse before it gets better. All the corrosion is actually gone. We've wire brushed it all completely smooth. We've gone back to bare metal pretty much everywhere. The thing is, obviously, because we've still got paint here, we've kind of wire brushed right the way back to bare metal here, we've then got a very definite lip. And obviously anything you can feel, you'll be able to see on your finished painted product. So next thing, we've got to start sanding smooth all the lips created by the places where we've wire brushed it back to bare metal. So for that, you want something fairly aggressive. We've got a 120 grit of sandpaper here, and we're going to start by sanding smooth all these little join lines. And then once we've done that, we can get on to the elephant in the room. Sanding ridges out is fairly self-explanatory. Anywhere you've wire brushed out corrosion, you'll be able to see. Attack it with 120 grit sandpaper and keep keep sanding it until you can't tell by feeling it where the line is. Depending on the extent of the corrosion and how heavily you've had to wire brush will dictate how much sanding is needed, but as a general rule just keep sanding it until the dust isn't caught in the ridge between the two, and without looking at it you wouldn't actually know where the transition was. If you've cut into the bare metal you might have to sand a bit harder to smooth the marks over, or use a coarser sandpaper. Do the best you can, but don't worry if it's not perfect. There's an upcoming step that will rectify any particularly heavy marks. All the corroded areas are now completely sanded smooth. The next biggest issue is going to be the kerb marks. This one is particularly bad. That is actually really sharp. You can actually hurt yourself on that. It is just rippled metal, which means of course you can sand it smooth again, but with something a little bit more aggressive than the 120 that we've been smoothing out the lines with the corrosion spots are. We're using some very bitey 80 grit, and I'm going to go around and sand as much of these smooth as possible before we then refine it and smooth it out completely with an extra little touch. Sanding kerbing out is a mixed bag. General kerb rash is quite soft and it's fairly easily smoothed with 80 grit paper, but heavier kerbing requires lots of heavy sanding to get it smooth. Don't forget the edge of the rim, sanding with the shape of the wheel to bring back the smooth rounded edge. Once the rough paper's taken the edge off, some 120 grit paper blends the edges into the rest of the wheel. Once again, this is a touch rather than seeing exercise, but eventually you should be left with smooth edges where once there were rough kerb marks. It's been a long haul, but finally every single kerb mark has been sanded smooth right the way, so that you can run your finger all the way around this wheel and not once are you at any risk of slicing yourself in half, which is always nice. The bigger kerb marks however are not quite as easy to get out as just some heavy sanding. Bits like this one here, it might look smooth but you can still feel pretty much each and every one of these tiny little dinks in it. What we're going to do is introduce you to a little friend of mine. This is alloy wheel filler, and this is pretty much the answer to your prayers if your prayers involve, dear deity, how do I get all the kerb marks out of my wheel? How does it work, you ask? Let me explain. Scoop some filler onto a mixing surface, in this case a piece of cardboard. Then add hardener, 3% of the amount of filler you're using. Yep, that looks like about 3%. Mix it into the filler until there's no trace of the pink and the filler is slightly thicker. At this point you'll have to work quickly as it starts to go hard within about 5 minutes. Tape near each area you're filling is an easy marker, and it also helps prevent getting filler on the tyre. Use the supplied card to smear blobs of filler roughly into shape on each low spot. Apply a lot, most of it won't be sticking around. Once you've smeared filler onto each spot, leave it for 20 minutes to harden, and then transition seamlessly from voiceover to speaking in the moment. Next you're going to need to sand it flush with the rest of the wheel. Now the manufacturer of the filler does recommend 240 grit for this, but frankly it's too soft, it takes far too long. I've got some 120 grit, and what you want to do is just start brushing into it. Now depending on how big of a lump you've put on there, you can actually go quite aggressive with it at first, rub quite hard to take most of it off, because the vast majority of this is just going to be sanded off completely, and then as you get closer to the wheel you can then go a little bit softer, a little bit gentler to make sure that you don't sand too much off, at which point you just knocked all the filler off and wasted your time. So basically just keep sanding it down until you get flush with the surface of the wheel, and the closer you get, the softer you sand. So let's do that. It can be hard to get the pressure right, since sanding too heavily for too long will simply sand off the filler altogether. It might take a few goes to get every mark covered and to smoothly blend the filler into the shape and smoothness of the wheel, but once again if you can't feel it, you've probably got it. After filling, sanding and smoothing all the kerb marks down, it's time to Scotch-Brite any areas that aren't already sanded or filled. Press quite firmly with the Scotch-Brite and cover every area of paint on the wheel until it's completely dulled and smooth to the touch. Then use compressed air, provided in this case by an airline, to blow all the dust clear. The amount of paint and filler dust that's likely stuck to the wheel and in all the little crevices means that this is an often overlooked but vital step for the best paint finish. Dust cleared, it's time for masking. Run masking tape deep into the rim edge where it meets the tyre, and then use a thin flat bladed screwdriver to press it into place. Make sure you can't see any of the tyre at the rim edge, otherwise you'll likely get paint on it and that'll look crap regardless of how good your actual painting is. Keep masking until you've covered a good few inches of the tyre, and don't forget the valve. Again, it's a small detail but it's worth remembering to avoid a crap final result. Our wheel's been wire brushed, sanded, filled, sanded a bit more, masked up, cleaned, prepped and ready to go. And you know what that means? It's time for
Joe Paints Random Stuff. Do.
Yep, and on this episode of Joe Paints Random Stuff, it's what was once a very knackered Alfa Romeo wheel. First of all, it's primer. I'm going to start with a just very light dust coat, so let's do that. As ever, the first coat of primer gets dusted on, but if you've gone back to bare metal anywhere, don't be surprised if it takes up to 4 coats of primer to completely cover it. Once the primer's evenly covered and left to dry for an hour or so, it's time for the paint. Now for the actual colour on the wheels, we are once again going to be using the Rover Charcoal Grey. I figured it works so well on the mirrors, it's a fantastic colour and I've got a few cans of it spare, so let's colour match the wheels with the mirrors. There's nothing more to teach you about painting these wheels that you wouldn't learn from having watched every video on this channel at this point, so without further ado, let's cue a quick montage. It's the next day, the wheel is all dry, and now it's time to unmask it. And do so very gently by pulling the tape away from the wheel so you don't pull all the paint off. This is going to be oh so satisfying. The wheel is done. How incredible does this look? That paint looks awesome, and every single curb mark and ding and scuff and all that corrosion has completely gone. And if you thought it looked good in the shade, oh, check it out in the sunlight. Look, with all the light hitting it, you can see all the metallic pearl flake in that paint, and my god, is there a lot of it. That just looks absolutely incredible. Right, now we know the wheel looks awesome. Let's get it on the car. Quick shout out to my latest tool, by the way. These are wheel sockets. You've got the common sizes for wheel nuts, 17, 19 and 21 millimeters. That's in reverse for those of you paying attention. And what they are is a normal socket for taking your wheel nuts and wheel bolts on and off, but they've got this plastic casing around the actual socket, and that means you can take one on off without scratching your, in my case, completely freshly painted and refurbished wheels. 10 quid for a set of 3, and you will save loads of money and loads of frustration in damaging your wheels. Winner! For those of you that say you never see me actually torque anything up when I'm doing bolts, that was for you. Yes, I know there's no centre cap. The one for this wheel is broken. There is a replacement one on the way. Et voila! And that is how you refurbish a wheel. I am chuffed with the results of this job, frankly. All the curb marks, all the flaking paint, all the corrosion are a thing of the past, and in their place, a gorgeous finish in that fantastic Rover Charcoal Grey. Is this up to the standard of a 150 quid per wheel professional job that you'd pay someone else to do? Not quite. But then again, was it done by a professional? No, definitely not. And did it cost 150 quid per wheel? Absolutely not. In fact, I worked out that including the cost of the primer, the paint, the lacquer, the filler, the masking tape, everything you need to do this job on your wheels, you're looking at about 10 quid a wheel to do this. Less than 50 quid will see all 4 of your wheels transformed, and frankly that is what this channel is all about. Bang for buck jobs you can do at home and get a real sense of satisfaction when you've done them. So that's what one wheel looks like, but what do they all look like in the same colour coded with the mirrors on the whole car, you ask? Well, you'll have to wait for another day when I've got a centre cap on this wheel and a front bumper on the car. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching everybody, and have a brilliant rest of your day. Catch you soon and have a good one.